Hello and welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather. We have had our Harvest Right freeze dryer for I think not quite 3 weeks, and ever since we got it, we basically have not let it rest. And I am very eager to start another batch, but I figured before I did, I would bring you along and kind of show you more in depth what this thing is all about. These freeze dryers come in a few different sizes. I believe it's a small, medium, large, extra large, and there's also one that you can buy that's for pharmaceuticals. This is the home freeze dryer, and we purchased the large size. So the large size freeze dryer needs a 20 amp circuit, its own dedicated circuit, and we have that right here. I have heard that a 20 amp circuit is also required for the medium and the small size, but on the website, it just says recommended, but for this size, it says that it's required. So we do have it hooked up to its own circuit. And one of the things that I was apprehensive about before we purchased our freeze dryer was I was worried about what it would be like to clean, because I always think about stuff like that. Like, how hard is this going to be to maintain? So I actually want to take this apart super quickly because I know I'm going to be able to put it back together super quickly just to show you the simplicity of this and how easy it would be to clean if and when you ever needed to. So you open the door, and this tray right here, or this rack, holds all of the trays. And there's actually, let me pull this off. This is the door seal, comes off real simply. And this rack comes out, and if I turn it a little bit, you can see little orange plates on the top side. These are the heating plates, which I was not aware was actually part of the freeze drying process, was heating just a little bit. But this thing pulls right out. There's a cord that attaches it to the computer part of the freeze dryer. And if we needed to, we could unplug this. And as you can see in there, it's very basic, very simple, super easy to clean. Back there on the bottom, there is a drain, and I'll show you where that comes out. See how simple that was to put back together? Lickety split. So that drain hole on the inside of the machine actually is attached to this little valve here, which we will close when we freeze dry today, but it drains down into this bucket here, and it's actually a really simple system. So as I mentioned, we've had our freeze dryer for a few weeks, and we have been working it nonstop. We have had tons of fun freeze drying things like peppers that have been sitting in my freezer since last year. And being able to have these guys freeze dried and ready to go in our dishes has really made it a lot more accessible. We have freeze dried things like peppers, blueberries, melons, pickles, peas, bananas, strawberries, pineapple, kale, and we've even played around with freeze drying lots of different candies. Another thing that I have freeze dried that we are going to focus on freeze drying today is herbs and tea flowers. So this here is chamomile that I recently freeze dried, and it essentially looks like it just came off of the plant. But this is perfectly preserved, and they'll stay good and keep their nutrition for about 25 years, which blows my mind. So in contrast, this is actually some chamomile that I preserved last year. I have a hanging herb dryer that I actually really love, but can you see the difference? One of these things definitely looks more appetizing and more alive. Here's actually some wild rose that we foraged that we kept for teas. Look at the color. It has maintained so much color and nearly all of the nutrition, which is really important when it comes to your herbs, because our herbs can be so beneficial to our bodies and really help elevate all the food that we grow here. So we are going to be freeze drying a couple different herbs today, actually a few different herbs. I have some oregano, some mint, and some lemon balm. Before we really get going on that though, I want to show you this freeze dried strawberry. This is from our garden, and I'm gonna see if I can get the camera to pick up the snap. Did you hear that? This is perfectly dried. There is essentially no moisture in this at all, but it still has all of the flavor. It's crazy. The texture is obviously different because there's no moisture in it, but that right there is a strawberry. Okay, one more and then we'll get into it. This is a banana slice. Very light and airy. Harder to break. Oh, I was probably talking over that. Yeah. It's just delicious and kind of strange to get used to at first, but actually really addicting to eat freeze-dried fruits. So we're going to load the trays into the freeze dryer, but before we start any kind of freeze drying cycle, this actually has to cool down. It has like a pre-freezing process that takes about 15 minutes. So I'm gonna get that going while we load the trays. Everything is already set. I don't have to change any settings or all. This is actually really intuitive, which I love. So I'm just gonna click start. And it's gonna do its thing. I have pre-frozen all of the herbs that we're going to be freeze drying today. That's not a requirement. It supposedly helps the freeze dryer work a little bit faster, but I don't know how true that is because it has to get to a certain super low temp anyway, and that does take a little bit of time. So like I mentioned, our freeze dryer fits 5 of these large trays. They do make silicone mats that you can put down just to help things not stick or to be able to remove things from the tray a lot easier. I'm not gonna use that today. I'm not gonna need it for herbs. This here is our frozen mint, and I'm just gonna pile this on. It's fine to have multiple layers of things, of most things on the freeze dryer tray, but I don't want it to be too much higher than the lip of the tray. So I'm trying to be mindful of that. This here is oregano from the garden. And the last thing is going to be our lemon balm. Okay, our 15 minutes is up and it has cooled down sufficiently to where it can begin the freeze drying process. So I'm going to open this up and load our trays. So remember how I talked about how intuitive this machine is? It tells you exactly what to do on the screen. It tells us to load the trays into the freeze dryer, which we've done, and then close the drain valve. And then all you have to do is click continue and it does its thing. So at the moment, not a lot is happening. What's gonna happen over the next several hours is this whole chamber is going to get super, super cold. I've heard people say that it gets down to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I've personally never seen it get that low. I've seen it get to negative 15, which is still pretty darn cold. And at that point, our pump is gonna turn on and create a vacuum inside the chamber. And what that's gonna do is take the ice crystals that are inside the food and sublimate those crystals and basically turn them into vapor, and that water vapor is going to come out of the food and it's going to stick to the insides of the chamber as ice, and it's really actually amazing. Right now everything is pretty quiet. Honestly, this isn't louder than maybe your standard refrigerator or like a microwave when it's running or something like that. It does get significantly louder when the pump turns on, but honestly, I don't think it's a bad type of noise. When that kicks on, I'll be sure to bring you in here so you can hear what that's like. We're about 3.5 hours into the process and our pump kicked on about 10 minutes ago. And you can probably tell that you can hear it, but also it's really not so loud that you can't talk above it. So over here is the pump. You can see that black line where it's connected to the freeze dryer. It does have its own power source that plugs into the back of the freeze dryer. So the freeze dryer knows exactly when to turn the pump on and when to turn the pump off. I feel like the noise is about as loud as that window air conditioner unit. So if you're used to something like that going, I feel like you could be used to hearing something like this. We are running the freeze dryer in our shed. It's outside of our house, so we don't hear this at all. But I feel like even if we had space in our house for the freeze dryer, the noise of it wouldn't bother us at all. So once the freeze dryer detected that it was cold enough, it went ahead and turned on the pump, and that created a vacuum inside this chamber. So right now we're running at about 470 millitors. I don't know what that means, but it's some kind of unit of measurement for the vacuum pressure. And what's happening now and what will happen over the next several hours is that sublimation of the ice crystals within the food. Those are going to be essentially sucked out and all that ice is going to accumulate on the inside of the drum. So we're going to go ahead and let this do its thing. I'm going to go ahead and go to bed Usually it takes about 24 hours start to finish for a freeze-dry cycle. It really kind of just depends on what you're freeze-drying, but herbs are so thin, I feel like it's not gonna take as long. So at some point tomorrow we'll come and check this thing out when it's all done. Okay, so it's the next day and it looks like this whole process from freezing to freeze drying took about 12 hours, almost 12 hours, which means that this finished at probably right around 3 o'clock in the morning. So obviously I was fast asleep, and then when I woke up I had to do things. I had to go do my milking chores, make breakfast for the kids and all that, and I didn't have to tend to this right away, which is one of the things that I really like about this freeze dryer. Is what it does when it's finished with the process and you don't tend to it right away is it just freezes everything. It kind of just stays there. It keeps a little bit of the vacuum and it's gonna sit there and wait, and nothing is going to happen to your food in the meantime. It's going to be there and ready for you when you are ready to deal with it. So because it has been finished for a few hours, it is 9 degrees Fahrenheit or -9 inside the chamber. That means that these trays are going to be very, very cold. So that I can handle them well, I'm just going to click warm trays. And those orange pads that we saw in the very beginning, those are going to warm up and make the trays handleable. In the meantime though, I can open this drain valve and release the pressure from inside the freeze dryer. So this is the first tray. This looks like the mint. Very, very brittle, completely dry. And all of the aromatics are still very present. As I'm squishing them down here into the jar, this whole room probably smells like mint. And the oregano is exactly the same. I think I did 3 trays worth of oregano. So there's a couple different ways that freeze-dried foods can be stored. There's probably more than a couple, but the 2 ways that I choose to do it is just like this in the mason jar. We've done this most often because most things that we've freeze-dried, we plan to use within the next year to 18 months, and we don't really need something this heavy-duty for short-term storage. So I'm gonna go ahead and attach my vacuum seal attachment that I have with my food saver, vacuum seal these jars, and we'll be able to use these within the next, like I said, 12 months to 18 months, and they're gonna be just fine in here. But if I want to keep something a little bit more long term, like I said, these herbs and things can last 25 to 30 years. I'm going to want to use something like this. This is a Mylar bag. They're nice and thick. They prevent any kind of light from entering, and we will also put an oxygen absorber inside. All of the freeze dryers come with a package of these bags plus this heat sealer for the bags. It's really awesome that they include all of this, and it's not something you have to think about or buy extra. I have decided that I am going to put some of the oregano away for long-term storage. I have tons of it growing out there, and we're going to be putting away a lot of it. Holy cow, it smells good. Lots of oregano straight in the bag. And inside the bag, I am going to throw one of these oxygen absorbers. Even the moisture in the air inside the bag can rehydrate what's in the bag to a degree and decrease its shelf life. So putting in one of these will help keep the lifespan of the food at its peak. So we've got the oxygen absorber in there, we've got our food. I'm just going to put this bag in the heat sealer. It's already set to 7, which is what we need. Push it down, wait for the light to go out, and it's all sealed. You can tell better back here. That's what that heat sealer just accomplished. I'm gonna do it one more time for good measure. In my book, they say that a lot of people like to do 2 heat seals just to make sure, and why not? It doesn't cost any more money. Just like that. There. Now we're double sure. And it's hard to imagine that in 25 to 30 years, either us or our kids could open this and have oregano from our garden that has just as much nutrition then as it does now. Super crazy to think about, but it's really cool too. See all the moisture that came out of that food? It's collected as ice on the side of the freeze dryer, and so I have a couple different options up here of what I could choose. I could decide not to do a defrost cycle on the machine and just let it thaw out all on its own. If I felt like the food needed to dry a little bit more, we could have left it in for a little bit more dry time. Or what I'm going to decide to do today is actually run a defrost cycle. And before each defrost cycle, the pump, the type of pump that we have, is going to purge itself. It's just part of the process. This is a little bit loud, but it only lasts for 5 minutes. If I wasn't planning to use the freeze dryer again really quickly, I absolutely could have just left the door ajar, and the warm air from inside the shed would melt that ice and drain out the drain pipe, and by the time I needed to use it again, it would probably be nice and defrosted. But I do plan on throwing some eggs in here later, because apparently freeze-dried eggs reconstitute really well. I'm really excited to see how well that works out for us come winter time when our girls really slow down on laying. But for right now, that's gonna need 2 hours to defrost and be ready. And so let's do a little bit of a Q&A about these freeze dryers. I think the main question that people probably have about the freeze dryer is it worth it? Because obviously the freeze dryer is a pretty major investment as far as food preservation goes. And I think that it's probably not worth it for everybody, but it kind of just depends on how you operate on your farm or on your homestead or in your household even, because you don't have to produce your own food in order to own one of these and in order to benefit from them and for them to be worth it. There are people who really will shop the sales and use these freeze dryers to put away food for long term. Really helps them take advantage of sales like that without having to run all kinds of freezers or their canner or something like that in order to benefit. We absolutely feel like it's going to be worth it here. So again, we haven't had this thing for very long, but I can absolutely see the benefit that this is going to bring to our farm, and it is an investment up front that will eventually pay for itself. We're obviously not there yet, but I can see that it can and will come. An example of that is I went through one of our freezers that we have on our farm. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 freezers. So some of those are attached to refrigerators, but some of those are standalone freezers. And as you can imagine, that takes a lot of money just to run all of those freezers. And honestly, some of that food that was in the freezers, I've forgotten I even had. So for an example, we had melon that I had apparently grown tons of melon in 2020, and I had put some in the freezer, and I can remember that my intention was to pull the melon out and make a melon jam from it. It's a little bit of rebel canning, but I do dabble in a little bit of rebel canning from time to time, but I never got to it. But obviously it's 2023 now, so I had some melon in the bottom of this freezer that kind of looked crystallized. It wasn't exactly freeze burned or anything, but it just at this point we're coming into the growing season again, and we've got all kinds of melons starting to blossom actually out on the lane on the farm. And so what I was able to do was stick that melon in the freeze dryer and then set it in front of my kids, and the melon is gone now. I mean, that melon probably cost a lot to preserve for those 3 years out in our freezer. This particular freezer is outside in one of our sheds. We actually have quite a few refrigerators and freezers outside that are running in the heat and all of that. And so that melon costs a lot anyways to keep in the freezer, but to stick it through the freeze dryer is just one time cost to preserve it, and then it doesn't cost anything to keep at room temperature and to be shelf stable and to retain that kind of nutrition for that long. So that leads into another question that I have seen a lot was, isn't this expensive to run? And I don't have a kilowatt meter, so I don't know exactly how much each batch costs me to run, but I have watched tons of videos where people do have a kilowatt meter attached, and they can tell exactly how much power these use. And in general, it takes or costs about in between $2.50 and $3.50 per batch. But again, that's one time. I actually have no idea how much it costs to run each of our freezers. But if you think about the fact that that energy only goes into that food, that energy cost only goes into that food one time, you can really start to see how that can add up over time in your favor. So a little earlier in the video, I had talked about how easy this was going to be to maintain. And my only main concern has been with cleaning it. And that's because there's really little to no maintenance that's needed on this combo that we have We've got the freeze dryer here, but then the main thing is our vacuum pump. So that's one of the reasons that we upgraded, because I wanted to have as little maintenance as possible. And the only maintenance that usually is needed is on the pumps. And there's essentially no maintenance needed on the oilless pump. Now, does things sometimes break and go wrong? Of course. It's probably a good idea to have like a mechanical person in your area that can service something like this. If not, I have heard of people shipping their pumps and things back into Harvest Right, especially if their freeze dryer is still under the 3-year warranty, and then Harvest Right takes care of it there. So there's another really common question of what can you really freeze dry? And the list is very, very long. What you can't freeze dry is a much shorter list, and even then I feel like there's probably some wiggle room. So it's not suggested that you freeze dry really oily foods. That's because there's more chance that in long-term storage, something super oily, the oil itself is just going to go rancid. Obviously, oil is different from water. This system really is just going to pull the water out of the food, but not the oil. And oil itself, fat itself, doesn't have the best shelf life. However, I have seen and heard where people will use things like butter and peanut butter and other oils and things as ingredients, and those things will freeze dry just fine. I don't know the science behind it, it's just what they say. Got my little booklet here that I'm doing as a cheat sheet, and they also say that you probably shouldn't freeze dry things like honey, syrups, jams, or jellies. It says these foods make a sugary mess when freeze dried and can't be reconstituted. But again, you could include them as an ingredient and things should work out just fine. It also has a slice of bread up here in the what can't be freeze dried section. It's not that you can't freeze dry bread, you can. It's just that it's kind of difficult to reconstitute and get that back to the same texture that it was before it went in. It's just super easy for bread and things to get ultra soggy, and balancing out how much water to add can be a little bit difficult with those items. So some things like meat, you don't really have to worry about how much water you reconstitute those things with. Some things will only take in as much water as they need to reconstitute and then no more. Other things will overhydrate and just be a mushy mess. And so you kind of have to play around with it, but also there are these guides that come with the freeze dryer that really help guide you through that, because somebody has already done it and they've already reported on it. Like as far as the eggs go that I am going to freeze dry and have not done yet. It's actually been a couple days. I don't know if you could tell by my change of outfit, but I think it's something like 2 tablespoons of dry eggs plus 2 tablespoons of water equals 1 egg. If I were to add more water than that, it would be not quite an egg, it would be a watery egg. And so some things are going to have a little bit of variability like that. Can you freeze dry raw meat? You can. You can freeze dry raw meat, which I was actually surprised to hear. You really shouldn't be eating raw meat, because what it does is, I mean, it'll take the moisture out of it, but it doesn't kill any of the microorganisms necessarily that could be on the meat. So when you reconstitute raw chicken breast, for example, you're going to want to put that chicken breast in water in the refrigerator and let it rehydrate in the refrigerator and use it just like you would any kind of raw meat. And I probably would not be trying to eat freeze-dried raw meat. It does not sound like a good idea. So if you are interested in a little bit more information, or if you're interested in buying a Harvest Right freeze dryer, we do have an affiliate link that I'm going to put in the pinned comment or in the description box. I encourage you to click that link if you do happen to purchase anything from that website, whether it be a freeze dryer or something else like these really cool little inserts that I'm actually going to use a little bit later to make all kinds of ice. Our family will get a cut from that, and it helps us a whole lot at no extra cost to you. I really appreciate it. And if you have any more questions about the freeze dryer, I haven't had this very long, so I might not have all of the answers, but I'll do what I can to answer them. And if I can't answer them, I'll do what I can to point you in the right direction.